I think every Zelda fan has a favorite game. Some are rocking and cocking and throwing out their backs to Zelda 1, and others are popping and locking to Ocarina of Time. But what if I told you there's one equally as good and often misunderstood? One that the true SNES faithful would die for with a controller in hand. I know it might be shocking for some that a series with over 15 games is allowed to have more than one good one, but with Zelda, it's the norm. When I decided to revisit A Link to the Past after several failed attempts, I initially played it for gaming historical reasons. I wanted to see the beginning of the traditional 2D games because I always thought if Zelda 1 was the skeleton, A Link to the Past bulked that shit up. And after making my ranking video of all 2D Zelda games and exposing my own gaming shortcomings, I realized I needed to see this one through to the end, especially since I had this impression that there wasn't much new to uncover compared to the 3D games. But now I wanted to exclusively talk about why this one spoke to me. Not literally, it doesn't have a mouth, but it does make the SNES sound chip its bit. I wanted to hopefully convince some other doubters to give this game a shot and defend this classic, especially since I think there's a lot of hidden depth and less appreciation for what this game did back in the day that has been lost to time. Get it? So with that, link your finger to the like button, subscribe button, and watch my other videos if you like this one. Also, there's so many ways to play A Link to the Past, including Switch Online, which is ugly as shit layout, but whatever, let's get into it. So The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past released on the SNES April 13th, 1992 in North America, when I was approximately -4 years old. This year, President Bush vomited on the Prime Minister of Japan, which some believe was a response to A Link to the Past only releasing in Japan first. The first SMS text message was sent, often theorized to be in the shape of a dick, and many kids would have been clamoring for games like Super Mario Kart, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and of course, the latest Legend of Zelda game. Now, I haven't heard too many personal stories about this game's release. I heard people talk about Ocarina of Time or the OG Zelda to death and their impact on gaming. But even over a decade later, when I first tried A Link to the Past on the Game Boy Advance, I couldn't help but smile. This game is so charming and the intro sets up the world so perfectly. The pixelated world is so vivid and the music blows away old TV speakers and those shitty Game Boy Advance ones. There is an extreme level of polish I feel from this game. It's something I really feel when I play this game that makes it hard to describe, but I'll try. This game makes you feel like a pixelated pink-haired elf guy who lives with his uncle. There, that's it. But your first mission is to save Princess Zelda from the bug-eyed evil wizard Aghanim. She is trapped in the depths of Hyrule Castle, and this gives you an immediate purpose in this world. And there's nothing a young man loves more than saving a beautiful pixel princess, except for maybe a good podcast and some porn. And while I wasn't necessarily sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for the next story development, I couldn't help but get addicted to obtaining the next goal or reaching the next dungeon. This game has some of the best pacing I have ever experienced. If you want to beeline the objectives, you can. If you want to take a 30-minute break to explore the overworld, you can do that as well and be fabulously rewarded with new items and side content. And all it really takes is getting through the first 30 to 40 minute sequence, and then after that, the game's pacing is really up to you. By the end, this game only lasted me about 11 to 13 hours, but more importantly, I never remember getting bored. And between the visuals and the remarkable sound design and the expansive overworld, there is an experience here that goes beyond what you might expect from this formative title. Now, story and lore is something I look forward to in a Zelda game and something I often thought this game lacked. And after this intro, I was still very lukewarm on this game's narrative. But then I did something that you couldn't possibly guess, something that turned this game's intrigue from a 5 to a 9. I read the game's manual. Now, we're going to take a little detour here, but I think it's paramount to immersing yourself in 1992 and getting the most out of A Link to the Past. This game does an okay job at introducing the story, but the manual, oh my, this manual is absolutely intoxicating. I was so excited just reading through this game's lore, and it was apparent that they really did intend you to read this before playing the game, something I don't think most modern gamers do when coming back to this title. I mean, how many times have you looked up a copy of a manual before playing a classic game nowadays? Well, I'd argue you should, and A Link to the Past is a shining example of why. The background in here reads like a beautiful short story and timeline of events that led up until this moment, and you can take it at your own pace while gawking over the detailed, beautiful art. And if you really want to immerse yourself, I highly recommend you force your mom to drive your 30-year-old ass to the GameStop so you can read it on the way back like a true kid. The manual is a true treat, and I really think amplifies the experience, and I highly recommend you do it on your next playthrough. And it just makes me want to go back and read more manuals. I know this is maybe a little bit of a weird thing to point out, but I know I've just heard so many people say that this game's story is not there or it's non-existent. But I think that's kind of wrong. I think the best way to experience the beginning of the story is through the manual to set you up for the rest of the experience. Because while the game does try to do that in the intro, I think it is just a tad lackluster, at least compared to what I was reading in the manual. But enough about the manual, let's get back to the game. Now, one of the reasons I think I keep coming back to A Link to the Past, despite never finishing until very recently, is the clear polish and attention to detail that went into its development. Despite seeing speedruns of this game where they just completely obliterate the game's code, playing it casually, you never really run into a lot of those bugs and glitches. And one of the biggest improvements I found for this game over Zelda 1 is the ability to move diagonally, adding additional 4 direction to Link's movement. We have officially transcended to the 8th direction. In fact, Link's movement options in this game are so important that they spent pages explaining all this in the good old gaming manual. Walking around the overworld, leaping off of ledges, pushing blocks, and even using the screen clearing sprint attack after you obtain the Pegasus shoes, which is one of the best feeling moves in gaming if I'm being honest. I know this might sound a little pathetic to some, but why is this loser excited about moving in 8 directions? Well, you see, for the first 4 years of my life, I could only move in 4 directions, you insensitive prick. Can you tell I'd only played Pokemon games on the Game Boy around this time? Going back to Zelda 1 has always been a struggle, as I feel like I'm fighting with Link to make sure I go in the right direction, on the right tile before getting booped to death. But while playing A Link to the Past, I never got that resistance. I never felt like I was moving slow, and as a modern gamer, there are a lot of older games that can't keep up with my TikTok brain. But this game was actively bending the minds and expectations of children everywhere decades earlier. It's so much smoother and easier to avoid enemies, and the sword swing provides about 120 degrees of coverage from enemies, with a satisfying sound effect every time you strike a colorful flamboyant guard into a poof of pixelated guts. If you really want to get fancy and hold the attack button, you can harness the energy of the game's code itself into a devastating whirling blade technique, which is always fun to do. And it does take a little getting used to at first, but I would say the beginning of this game has a tendency to be very easy, especially if you're used to 2D Zelda, at least a little bit. But I don't think this game ever gets boring. Despite being a lifelong gamer with over 2 decades of experience, every once in a while there was just that one boss where the tension would rise exponentially and I was left with only 1 or 2 hearts. And that annoying, frustrating, and heart-beating music would start playing. That being said, the more you explore, the more tools you add to your arsenal, and when you do get more tools like the bow or the bombs and various other items that the manual talks about, it becomes either a puzzle of finding out what damages the enemy most, or what feels best for you. And I implore you to pick up the game for a bit and at least try it out, preferably after finishing this video. And I doubt I'd see one person come back and say, this game feels mid, unless you're a sassy little shit. Now, mastering the basics is important. Yeah, I'm kind of getting excited about something that seems basic, but you have to nail down the game feel, especially when going back to these older games. These fundamentals are like a reliable, well-built chassis holding up the more fun new elements that we're going to talk about now, such as items like the hook shot, which made their debut in this game and add an extra layer of traversal and finding secrets. While others like the ice rod, I mostly found myself using offensively to freeze enemies in place, and I don't see why you couldn't give this game to a child nowadays and them not being able to figure out most of what this game has to offer, or why you couldn't just handicap yourself with a couple alcoholic beverages next weekend, reduce your brain and motor skills to that of an 8-year-old kid, and have a blast. And the first 3 bosses and dungeons here are something that I have tackled before and found to go relatively smoothly, though I would recommend you get the ice rod ASAP, as it will make the second worm boss much easier than only having the bow. And after beating the first 3 areas, Zelda is captured once again by Aghanim, and you once again have to storm the castle to beat him off with your new sword, which transports you into what I believe is the end of the second tutorial, and into the main affair, the Dark World. Now from this point forward, there are a few more spoilers, but also not something the game manual itself doesn't kind of spoil. So seriously, while this thing is beautiful, it does kind of spoil a bit more than I would think you want to for new people playing this game. But be warned for those heathens that want a truly spoil-free experience that the developers didn't even intend. There's an immediate vibe shift after entering the Dark World. Yes, the world itself does change color, but I'm also talking about the intensity of the world and the dungeons. The overworld enemies are much more aggressive. After years of sexual frustration being trapped here, the dungeons get much more complex, and the first boss here was the first time I really died in the game. What a fucking asshole. The game starts to feel a little less linear here as well. There are more roadblocks as well to find the right key or key item to get the good stuff. And at this point, the game expects you to get good or get ready to die a lot. In fact, if you're not prepared, you might end up getting to this point of the game and quitting for years to come out of frustration. That's not me. That's definitely not a story about me and my first experience with this game on the Game Boy Advance. But while it feels oppressive, this game's pacing it's really all up to you. There's no shame in exploring a bit and getting more tools, including ones like the big magic hammer weapon tool that you get in the very first dungeon. It's one of my favorites to use in this entire game. It has a great weighty and impactful feeling when you hit an enemy. It's a complete power trip. And going on to the second dungeon in the Dark World, it starts to finally start easing you into using the magic mirror at various points to travel from the light world to the Dark World and back to solve puzzles. And while it does feel a tad more limited in this game compared to something like Prime 2, which I also recently played that has a similar design, it's what I think makes this game a cool experience for potential new players. If we'd only been able to explore the light world, I think this game would have been much more generic and vanilla, and most people wouldn't really come back to it and it wouldn't stand out. Because this element even has someone like myself hot off this game wondering how else I could have manipulated various things in the world to find secrets that I missed this first time. And going back and forth does reward you pretty well. For example, you get the upgraded Master Sword, the Tempered Sword, after you reunite these little dwarf brothers so they can make it together, which I hope neither of them dies or else they'd be quite out of business forever. Now there are still some quite annoying roadblocks throughout this as well, as I moved my way to Misery Mire, which I found miserable. I know, shocking. But I found that I couldn't enter the dungeon itself as I was being blocked by this mysterious tile. And after exploring and stabbing things like a good citizen of Hyrule, I finally found that I looked up a guide to figure out what I'd missed, and it turns out I had missed the Ether Medallion earlier on, which is one of the only times I did feel a slight halt in pacing, but again, I should have read the manual more or else I probably would have known. So sure, I was a tad annoyed, but I know a lot of people do like getting stumped and exploring, and this game really does let you do that. It's one of those games I know if I'd played it as an 8-year-old, I might not have been able to beat it on account of being a dumbass, but I know I would have had a lot of fun exploring this world, and who knows, I probably eventually would have stumbled onto the right path eventually, which is something I don't think we see a lot of in gaming these days. So many are very straightforward and tell you the answer right away, and there's just no time for running around and murdering things. And this game has a decent amount in common with a game like Elden Ring, especially with the map, which this is a bit of a tangent again, but this game's map is amazing. It is awesome. You look at it and it's just so clear where secrets might be hidden throughout the world, or at least where you should explore a little bit more. So this game's whole map just does so much to inspire you to just run over to a secluded section of the map and just mess around a bit. And when I'm doing that a lot in a game, I know it's doing something right. Now I want to get back to talking a little bit more about the dungeon design, as this is the main objective: to tackle a dungeon, smack a boss, and become a crystal hoarding freak. Most dungeons involve solving puzzles or eliminating roadblocks with either combat or finding key items. There's even tiles to help poor lost souls, even those bad at video games like me, to help you out so you're not too stalled in a dungeon and give you an idea what to do. One improvement this game has in its dungeons over Zelda 1 is that items are hard to find, but they're not impossible. There's no need to put yourself on an FBI watch list when you inevitably search how to buy bombs, so you have enough to throw at every single wall in sight. You just need to be a little bit more perceptive and engross yourself into the world so you know where to look. And slowly this game does a great job amplifying the stakes from dungeon to dungeon, scaling with your increasing knowledge of this game's mechanics. And difficulty scaling is something this game does really well. I think the only way you'll find this game maybe a little boring is if you've played other Zelda games before this one and you're coming back to it knowing all the tricks. But even if you do find the puzzles in the dungeons easy, there's no way you won't be tripped up by at least by one of the bosses, because some of the bosses in this game are really difficult, and the bosses in this game are not afraid to slap your tiny little green hat off your pink fluff and show you who's managing this establishment. A Link to the Past is full of clever touches all throughout the dungeon, and one of my favorite is actually the Skull Woods, where half the dungeon is outside in the overworld while the other half is hid behind a traditional temple-like door. This makes the dungeon feel pretty integrated in the world, not just some random temple that just popped up out of nowhere. It's almost like this place is so overrun with monsters that it's leaking into the overworld. This dungeon epitomizes the Dark World itself, of being a much drearier place than its light world counterpart, the Lost Woods, where you find the majestical Master Sword and a bunch of animal friends that you cannot kill. I know, I tried. And the final dungeon is a true testament to all you've learned from your journey. It is a true gauntlet. You're almost guaranteed to die at least once or twice. It's games like this that I start to understand why the bar for Zelda dungeons is so damn high, as this was essentially setting the bar for any future games that I've played. Anything lesser than this wouldn't live up to what the fans wanted, and overall I had a lot of fun navigating through all the dungeons in this game. But overall, I really enjoyed this game, and I just felt the need to make sure that other people that maybe were like me and had put this game off for such a long time actually gave this game a shot, but also so they know what to expect. This game is not going to hold your hand. This game is going to test you. But also, it's just a lot of fun, especially if you immerse yourself into the whole experience. And I think this game 100% stands the test of time and is something that holds up against games like Breath of the Wild or Ocarina of Time. And I can see while the numbers I think are diminishing, there are so many people that do still find this to be their favorite Zelda game. Even for myself, after beating this game for the first time, I finally believe it's something that I'll come back to. I'm not done with A Link to the Past, but I am done with this video.